When a husband walks in on his wife in their own bedroom with another man, everyone expects rage, shouting, maybe even violence. That's what she expected too. But what Everett Mercer does next shocks everyone. He simply turns and walks away without a word. No explosion of anger. No threats. Just silence. And that silence? It's the most terrifying response of all. Because Everett isn't the type of man to forget. He isn't the type to lash out wildly. He's the type who plans. The type who waits. The type who knows that some forms of justice require patience. What happens over the next few weeks will change everyone's lives forever. This is the story of a betrayal, a carefully crafted response, and a shocking revelation that no one sees. Coming, Everett Mercer tossed his car keys on the kitchen counter, grateful to be home a day early from his business trip to Denver. The house was quiet. Too quiet. But that was to be expected at 3:17 p.m. on a Thursday. Zara wouldn't be home from work for at least another 2 hours. He rolled his stiff shoulders and smiled, imagining her surprised face when she'd walk through the door to find him waiting with her favorite takeout and a bottle of that Pinot Noir she loved. 8 years of marriage, and he still enjoyed planning little surprises for her. Last month, it had been concert tickets hidden in her day planner. The month before, a weekend getaway to the mountains. This time, it was simply him, home earlier than expected, travel-worn but happy to be back in their space, instead of another generic hotel room. Everett grabbed a bottled water from the fridge and headed for the stairs. A shower first, then he'd run out for the food and wine. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his carry-on bag bumping softly against his leg. Halfway up, he paused. A sound. He tilted his head, listening. Maybe he'd left a window open, and it was the wind, or perhaps the neighbor's cat had somehow gotten in again. But no, this was different. A muffled voice? Music? Everett continued up the stairs, quieter now, curiosity pulling him forward. At the top of the landing, the sound became clearer. It was coming from their bedroom, and it was unmistakably human. His first thought was burglars, but burglars didn't typically hang out in bedrooms making noise in the middle of the afternoon. His second thought struck him like a physical blow. Zara was home, but Zara was supposed to be at work, presenting the quarterly marketing report she'd spent weeks preparing. Unless she'd finished early. Unless she'd come home sick. Unless... Everett's hand hovered at the partially open bedroom door. The sounds were clearer now, rhythmic, intimate, unmistakable. Time seemed to slow as he pushed the door open, his body moving on autopilot while his mind scrambled to deny what he already knew he would find. Their bedroom, the room they'd painted together when they bought the house, arguing playfully over sea foam versus sage green, was dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. But there was enough light to see them. Zara, her dark hair spilling across their pillows, and a man Everett recognized immediately as Dominic Reed, her co-worker from the marketing department. For 3 heartbeats, the world froze, in perfect, horrible clarity. Zara noticed him first, her eyes widening as she registered his presence in the doorway. She made a strangled sound and pushed at Dominic's shoulders. "Everett!" His name tore from her throat, part exclamation, part question. Dominic jerked upright, twisting to follow her gaze, sheet clutched to his waist. His face drained of color. "What the hell?" he started, but then fell silent, looking from Everett to Zara and back again. Everett felt oddly detached, as if watching the scene unfold on a movie screen. He noticed bizarre details. A sock draped over the reading lamp on Zara's nightstand, the half-empty glass of wine on his side of the bed. the unfamiliar cologne hanging in the air, clashing with the lavender linen spray Zara always used. He waited for the rage to come. Wasn't that what was supposed to happen? The betrayed husband, overcome with fury, shouting accusations, threatening violence? But all he felt was a cold, spreading numbness and the slow collapse of everything he thought he knew. Zara was scrambling now, trying to cover herself, her voice shrill as she repeated his name. "Everett, I can explain. It's not. This isn't." 8 years of conversations, promises, plans, and dreams flashed through his mind in an instant, crumbling like sand castles against the tide of this single, irrefutable moment. The luggage handle was still clutched in his hand. He looked down at his white knuckles as if they belonged to someone else. Zara had managed to wrap herself in the sheet and was moving toward him, her face a mask of panic and plea. Dominic was hurriedly pulling on boxers, muttering something about giving them space to talk. "Please," Zara said, reaching for him. "Please, just let me explain." Everett took a step back, out of her reach. He looked at her, really looked at her, this woman he'd built his life around, this stranger standing before him. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. "Everett!" Her voice followed him down the hallway, down the stairs. "Everett, please, come back. It's not what you think." But it was exactly what he thought. There was no confusion, no misunderstanding to clear up. The truth was as plain as the platinum band on his left hand, the one that matched hers, the ones they'd exchanged with vows that now echoed hollowly in his head. He got back in his car, tossed his bag on the passenger seat, and started the engine. Zara appeared on the front porch, still wrapped in the sheet, hair wild, face streaked with tears. "Everett, don't leave like this, please!" He backed out of the driveway, shifted into drive, and pulled away from the house, away from the life he'd thought was his. The sky was a perfect, mocking blue, the same sky that had been there this morning when his world still made sense. He drove without direction as the afternoon sun began its descent, his mind empty of everything except a single question, repeating like a broken record. What now? Everett found himself pulling into the parking lot of the Blue Pine Motel, a place he'd passed countless times but never had reason to visit. The vacancy sign flickered weakly in the gathering dusk. Perfect, anonymous, temporary. Just like his. Life had suddenly become. The desk clerk barely looked up from her magazine as she slid him a room key. "Room 114, checkouts at 11. His phone buzzed again, the 14th time in the 2 hours since he'd left the house. 13 text messages and a voicemail, all from Zara. He silenced the phone without looking at any of them and shoved it deep into his pocket. Room 114 smelled of industrial cleaner and cigarettes that had seeped into the walls despite the no smoking sign on the door. Everett dropped his bag on the faded bedspread and sat heavily beside it. The springs creaked under his weight. "What now?" he whispered to the empty room, but no answer came. 8 years. They'd been together for 8 years. College sweethearts, who'd met sophomore year when he'd literally bumped into her at the library, sending her stack of psychology textbooks flying. She'd been furious until he'd offered to buy her coffee as an apology. One coffee had turned into dinner, which had turned into breakfast the next morning. They'd been inseparable ever since, or so he'd thought. Everett stood and paced the small room, 5 steps in one direction, 5 steps back. When had things changed? When had he lost her? Was it gradual, like water wearing away stone? Or had there been a specific moment when she'd decided their marriage wasn't enough? He tried to think back, searching for signs he might have missed. There had been changes in the past few months. Zara working later than usual. Her sudden protectiveness of her phone. The way her eyes sometimes drifted when he talked about their future. "I've just been busy at work," she'd said when he'd mentioned it. "The Bellman account is taking up all my energy." The Bellman account, the one she was working on with Dominic. Everett's stomach twisted. How long had it been going on? Weeks? Months? The whole time she'd been working with Dominic? The mental image of them together flashed in his mind again, and he rushed to the bathroom, barely making it before emptying the contents of his stomach. Afterward, he rinsed his mouth and stared at his reflection in the spotted mirror. He looked the same. Somehow, that seemed wrong. Shouldn't there be visible evidence of his world collapsing? A crack across his face, perhaps? Or hollowness in his eyes? His phone buzzed again from the other room. Everett dried his face on a thin motel towel and went to retrieve it. 22 notifications now. The latest was a text that simply read, "Please come home. We need to talk. It's not what it looks like." Everett laughed, a harsh sound that surprised him. Not what it looks like? He hadn't caught them having a business meeting or planning a surprise party. He'd caught them in bed, their bed, doing exactly what it looked like. He typed out several responses, deleting each one before finally settling on, "I need space. Don't contact me again tonight." Then he turned off his phone completely and lay back on the bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that vaguely resembled the state of Texas. They'd had plans. So many plans. The house in the suburbs they'd bought 2 years ago, thinking about starting a family. The vegetable garden Zara had insisted on planting this spring. The trip to Portugal they'd been saving for, scheduled for their 10th anniversary. All those plans, all those shared dreams. Where did they go when the foundation they were built on crumbled? Everett closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, memories played like a film reel behind his eyelids. Zara in her graduation cap, laughing as he twirled her around after the ceremony. The nervous tremble in her voice as she'd said, "I do." The way she'd squeezed his hand when they'd gotten the keys to their house, whispering, "We're home. Home." He had no home now. Morning came, gray and featureless through the thin motel curtains. Everett had dozed fitfully, waking often from dreams where he was searching for something important, but couldn't remember what it was. He showered under lukewarm water, dressed in yesterday's clothes, and turned his phone back on. 36 notifications. He scrolled through them without reading, then pulled up a different contact. Marcus Harlow, his oldest friend, a lawyer who'd stood by him through his parents' messy divorce 20 years ago, and again when his father died 3 years back. Everett hesitated, then typed, "Need your help with something important. Can you meet me tomorrow?" The response came almost immediately. "Name the time and place. You okay? Was he okay?" Everett didn't even know how to begin answering that question. "Not really," he replied. "I'll explain tomorrow. Cora's Diner, 10 a.m. "I'll be there," Marcus responded. Everett grabbed his bag and checked out of the motel, declining the desk clerk's offer of a receipt. There would be no expense report for this stay, no paper trail he'd want to revisit later. In his car, he sat for a long time with the engine running. He should go to work. He should maintain normalcy. He should do something besides sit in a motel parking lot feeling like his rib cage had been pried open and everything inside scooped out. Instead, he drove to the lake where he'd proposed to Zara, parked in the empty lot, and stared out at the water. Canadian geese skimmed the surface, leaving ripples in their wake. Life went on. The world didn't stop turning because Everett Mercer's heart had been broken. The geese didn't stop migrating. The sun didn't stop rising, and Everett, despite feeling like he might shatter with his next breath, didn't stop either. He reached for his phone again and pulled up the browser, typing 3 words into the search bar. Divorce attorneys nearby. Everett stared at the words on his screen, his thumb hovering over the search button. After a long moment, he closed the browser and put his phone away. Not yet. He needed to think clearly before making any decisions, and clarity was in short supply right now. 3 days passed in a blur of sleepless nights at another anonymous motel and distracted days where he called in sick to work. He'd spoken briefly with Marcus, arranging to meet the following week instead. "I need to handle something first," he'd explained, though he wasn't entirely sure what that something was. On the 4th day, Everett drove back to the house. His house. Their house. He wasn't sure what to call it anymore. It was just after noon when he pulled into the driveway. Zara's car was there, which surprised him. She should have been at work. Had she taken time off? Called in sick like he had? The thought of her and Dominic both missing work made his stomach turn with fresh images he quickly pushed away. He sat in the car for 10 minutes, gathering his courage. He wasn't here for a reconciliation or even a proper conversation. He just needed clothes, his laptop, and the folder of important documents from his desk. In and out. 20 minutes, tops. When he finally unlocked the front door, the house was quiet, but felt watchful, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He stepped inside, keys jingling too loudly in his hand. "Everett?" Zara appeared from the kitchen, looking smaller than he remembered. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, strands escaping around her face. She wore an old university sweatshirt of his, the one she'd always claimed when she was sad or sick. Seeing her was harder than he'd expected. Despite everything, his first instinct was still to go to her, to comfort her. 4 days ago, he would have pulled her into his arms without hesitation. Now, he stood rooted to the spot, a stranger in what had been his home. "I just came for some things," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Zara nodded, wringing her hands. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know." "You didn't answer." "I know." An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they weren't saying. "Where have you been staying?" she finally asked. "Does it matter?" Zara flinched. "I was worried." Everett's laugh held no humor. "Worried? That's rich." "Ev, please." She took a step toward him. "Can we talk? I know what you saw, but..." "But what?" The words came out sharper than he intended. "It wasn't what it looked like." "Because I'm pretty sure it was exactly what it looked like." Tears welled in her eyes. "It was a mistake. A mistake," he repeated flatly. "Like accidentally putting salt in your coffee instead of sugar? That kind of mistake?" "I didn't mean for it to happen." "Did you trip and fall onto him? Multiple times?" Zara winced. "It only happened twice. I swear. Everett. It wasn't an affair. Not really. Just a stupid, horrible mistake that I would take back if I could. Only twice." The words echoed in Everett's head as he walked past her toward the stairs. Only twice she'd betrayed him. Only twice she'd made a mockery of their vows. Only twice she'd chosen someone else over their marriage. "Where are you going?" Zara called after him. "To get my things." She followed him upstairs, hovering in the doorway as he pulled a duffel bag from the closet and began filling it with clothes. "You're not even going to talk to me?" she asked, voice breaking. "What is there to say?" "I made a terrible mistake. I know that. But we've been together for 8 years, Everett. Doesn't that count for something?" Don't we at least owe it to each other to try and work through this? Everett paused, a stack of t-shirts in his hands. Would you be saying that if I hadn't caught you? Or would you still be sleeping with him while coming home to me every night? She had no answer for that. He continued packing, moving to the bathroom for his toothbrush and razor, then to the desk in the corner for his laptop. As he unplugged the charger, his eyes fell on the framed photo beside it. Him and Zara on their honeymoon, snorkeling in Belize, their faces sunburned and happy. I think I'm entitled to some answers, he said quietly, turning to face her. How long? Zara's shoulders sagged. 6 weeks, since the Bellman account started. And Dominic? Was he pursuing you? Or did you? It was mutual, she admitted, looking at the floor. We were working late, had a few drinks. It was stupid. Yes, Everett agreed. It was. He moved to his desk drawer, retrieving a folder of important documents: birth certificate, passport, insurance information. As he did, he subtly slipped a small notebook into his pocket. What about our bank accounts? He asked, his tone suddenly practical. The mortgage? Zara blinked, thrown by the shift. What? We have joint accounts. The house is in both our names. The car loans. We need to figure out what to do about all of that. Are you talking about divorce? Her voice was small. I'm talking about reality, Everett replied. You chose this, Zara, not me. But we both have to deal with the consequences. Just like that. 8 years together, and you're ready to throw it all away because of one mistake. Something inside Everett snapped. 2 mistakes. Remember? It happened twice, and I'm not the one who threw anything away. You did that when you brought another man into our bed. Zara's tears flowed freely now. I love you, Everett, not him. It didn't mean anything. If it didn't mean anything, that's almost worse. He zipped up the duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder. It means you risked everything we built together for something that didn't mean anything. He brushed past her toward the stairs, but she caught his arm. What are you thinking? She pleaded. Please, just tell me what you're thinking. Are you done with us? Are you filing for divorce? What's your plan? Everett looked at her tear-streaked face, at the eyes he'd once thought he'd be looking into for the rest of his life. I need time, he said finally. Don't call me, don't text. I'll contact you when I'm ready. He gently removed her hand from his arm and continued down the stairs. At the front door, he paused, fishing his house key off his keyring and placing it on the entryway table. The small sound it made seemed to echo in the silence. Everett, Zara called after him as he stepped outside. What are you going to do? He didn't answer, just closed the door behind him and walked to his car, aware of her watching him through the living room window. Inside his car, Everett pulled out the notebook he'd taken from his desk drawer. He flipped it open and added several notes to the list he'd already started. Joint bank accounts, mortgage, car loans. Only happened twice. 6 weeks. Since Bellman account. Says she loves me, not him. Didn't mean anything. He underlined the last part twice, then started the car. As he pulled away from the house, he took out his phone and dialed a number he'd saved 3 days ago, but hadn't yet called. Meridian Investigation Services. How can I help you? I'd like to schedule a consultation, Everett said, his voice steady, for the first time in days. It's regarding a personal matter. We have an opening tomorrow at 1 p.m. May I have your name? Everett Mercer. And what is this concerning, Mr. Mercer? Everett glanced in his rearview mirror at the house growing smaller behind him, at the life he was driving away from. Evidence gathering, he replied. for a case I'm building." 2 weeks later, Everett sat at his desk at Meridian Financial Group, staring blankly at spreadsheets that once would have commanded his full attention. Now, the numbers swam before his eyes, meaningless data points that couldn't compete with the chaos of his personal life. "Everett, did you hear me?" He looked up, to find Laurel Chen, his department head, standing in his office doorway with a concerned expression. "Sorry," he said, straightening. "I was just million miles away," she finished for him. "Again." "I'm sorry," he repeated. "The Peterson account. You needed the projections." Laurel stepped into his office and closed the door behind her. "The MIB projections can wait." "I'm worried about you." Everett managed a weak smile. "I'm fine." "You've lost weight. You're distracted. You look like you haven't slept in days." She sat in the chair across from his desk. "Everyone knows about you and Zara separating. No one expects you to be at 100% right now." The sympathy in her voice made his throat tighten. Since returning to work 3 days ago, he'd received variations of the same conversation from co-workers. Awkward expressions of concern, careful avoidance of specifics, and the implicit understanding that he was the wronged party. Office gossip traveled fast, especially when it involved the marketing director's wife and one of her team members. "I appreciate that," he said. "But work helps. Keeps my mind occupied." Laurel nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "If you need time off, I don't," he said, more sharply than intended. "Sorry, I need the routine right now." After she left, Everett checked his watch. 12:30. He had a therapy appointment at 1, something he'd never imagined needing before, but had quickly become the only hour of his week where he felt he could breathe freely. Dr. Patel's office was a 15-minute drive from Meridian. As Everett navigated the familiar route, he reflected on how quickly his life had become unrecognizable. 2 weeks ago, he'd been a happily married financial analyst with a comfortable home and plans for the future. Now, he was living in a sparsely furnished one-bedroom apartment, seeing a therapist twice weekly, and building a case against his wife, the woman he'd once trusted more than anyone in the world. Dr. Patel greeted him with her usual calm smile. At their first meeting, he'd been struck by how young she looked, but her quiet competence had quickly earned his respect. "How are you feeling today, Everett?" she asked once they were seated. "Angry," he admitted. "I thought I was past that, but it keeps coming back." "Anger is a normal part of grief," she reminded him. "And you are grieving. The loss of your marriage, the future you'd planned, the trust you had." Everett nodded. "I keep thinking about who I am, who I've always been. The guy who avoids conflict, the one who forgives easily. My college roommate totaled my car once, drunk driving. I forgave him, helped him get into rehab. My dad missed my college graduation because of work. I understood. I've never been the kind of person who holds grudges. But this feels different." "It is different," he said, leaning forward. "This isn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment. Zara made choices, repeated choices, and not just with the affair." Dr. Patel's expression remained neutral. "You mentioned, last time there was more to it than the infidelity." Everett reached for the bottle of water she always provided, buying time to organize his thoughts. "The Bellman account," he said finally. "It's a major client at Meridian. Wealth management for a tech mogul who recently sold his company for billions. Very high profile. Very lucrative. Zara and Dominic have been working together on the marketing strategy. And that's where their relationship began." "Yes, but there's more." Everett took a deep breath. "After I met with the private investigator, I started looking into their work together more closely. Dominic was hired 6 months ago. Zara pushed hard for him to get the job. She was on the hiring committee. They knew each other before. Everett nodded. College classmates. She never mentioned it during the hiring process, claimed she barely remembered him when I asked about the new hire. But the investigator found dozens of communications between them going back years. "I'm sensing there's more," Dr. Patel said gently. "There's always more," Everett said with a bitter laugh. The investigator found evidence that they've been working together to undermine me at Meridian. Zara had access to confidential financial analysis through our home computer, reports I was working on. She shared them with Dominic, who used the information to position himself for a promotion that would have put him above me in the company hierarchy. Dr. Patel's composure slipped slightly, her eyebrows raising. "That's potentially criminal. Corporate espionage." "Exactly. And it explains why they've both been so nervous since I left. They're afraid I know." "Do you plan to expose them?" Everett's session with Dr. Patel ended with the same question it always did. "What do you really want from all this, Everett?" It was a question he still couldn't fully answer, even to himself. Later that afternoon, he met with Caroline Winters, the divorce attorney Marcus had recommended. Unlike Dr. Patel's soothing office, Caroline's space was all sharp edges and glass, efficient and intimidating, like the woman herself. "Your investigator did good work," she said, reviewing the file he'd provided. "This goes beyond divorce territory into potential criminal charges." "I know. You could destroy them both with this," she continued, looking at him over her reading. "Glasses. End their careers. Possibly see them prosecuted." "I know that too." Caroline leaned back in her chair. "Then why do I get the sense you're hesitating? Most clients in your position would be out for blood." Everett stared out her office window at the city skyline. "I'm not most clients." Clearly. She closed the file. "So what is it you want, Mr. Mercer? Simple divorce? Financial settlement? Public humiliation? Revenge?" The word revenge made him flinch. Was that what he was planning? Revenge had never been in his nature. The thought of becoming someone consumed by bitterness and retribution felt like another loss. The loss of the person he'd always been. "I want justice," he said finally, "but I need to do this my way." Caroline studied him for a long moment. "Your way might not be the most advantageous legally." "I understand." "All right then," she said with a shrug. "It's your case. But whatever you're planning, be careful." People who betray others rarely appreciate being exposed, and they can become desperate when cornered. Everett left her office with a strange sense of calm. For the first time since discovering Zara's betrayal, he felt like he had a direction. Not just a reaction to what had happened, but a deliberate path forward. Back at his apartment, he opened his laptop and created a new folder titled Restoration Project. Inside, he began organizing the evidence the investigator had gathered. Emails between Zara and Dominic. Financial records showing unauthorized access to company files. Time-stamped records of information being transferred. His phone rang. Zara, again. She'd been calling daily despite his request for space. He let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text message appeared. "I miss you. Please talk to me. I made a mistake, but I love you. We can fix this." Everett stared at the words. 2 weeks ago, they might have weakened his resolve. Now, knowing what he knew, they only strengthened it. His doorbell rang, startling him. He wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, he saw a courier holding a large envelope. Delivery. For Everett Mercer. the young man said when he opened the door. Inside the envelope was the final report from Meridian Investigation Services. Everett sat at his kitchen table and spread out the contents: photographs, financial records, and a USB drive. One photograph in particular caught his eye. Zara and Dominic at a restaurant Everett had never seen, looking far more intimate than newly acquainted colleagues should. The date stamp was from 7 months ago, before Dominic was even hired at Meridian. Everett plugged the USB drive into his laptop. It contained a single video file, security footage from the Meridian office, showing Zara using Everett's ID badge to access his computer after hours. He sat back hard in his chair, a strange buzzing in his ears. The affair was bad enough, but this level of deception and betrayal was something else entirely. It wasn't just their marriage Zara had been willing to sacrifice. It was his career, his reputation, his future. For the first time since that afternoon in their bedroom, Everett smiled, not from happiness, but from clarity. Now he knew exactly what he needed to do. The next morning, Everett arrived at Meridian Financial Group 30 minutes earlier than usual. The office was quiet, most employees not due for another hour. Perfect. He needed privacy for what came next. He knocked on Laurel Chen's door, finding her already at her desk reviewing quarterly reports. "Everett," she said, surprised. "You're in early. I need to show you something," he replied, closing the door behind him. "It's important." Laurel's expression shifted from surprise to concern as Everett opened his laptop on her desk. "What am I looking at?" "Evidence of corporate espionage within Meridian." His voice was steady, professional. "Involving my wife and Dominic Reed." For the next 20 minutes, Everett walked her through the documentation, the unauthorized access, the leaked information, the timeline of deception. Laurel's face transformed from concern to shock to anger. "Why bring this to me and not Stewart?" she asked, referring to the company's CEO. "Because you're fair," Everett answered simply. "And because I wanted you to know, this has nothing to do with my marriage falling apart. This is about protecting the company." Laurel studied him for a long moment. "What do you want to happen, Everett?" "I want an internal investigation. By the book. No special treatment either way because of my personal connection." She nodded slowly. "I'll take this to legal today. They'll likely want to speak with you. I'm available whenever they need me." He closed his laptop. "And Laurel? Thank you." "For what?" "For believing me?" Her expression softened slightly. "The evidence speaks for itself. I'm just sorry you're going through this." Everett left her office feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The first piece of his plan was in motion. His next stop was Vincenzo's, an Italian restaurant where he and Zara had celebrated every anniversary since moving to the city. The owner, Marco, greeted him with the usual warmth, though his eyes held. "Questions? Everett, it's been too long. Where is the beautiful Zara today?" "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about, Marco." Everett gestured to a quiet corner. "Do you have a minute?" They sat at a small table near the kitchen, Marco's jovial expression fading as Everett explained the situation. Not all. The details. Just enough. The older man's face grew solemn. "I am sorry, my friend. Marriage is sacred. Such betrayal." He shook his head. "What can I do?" "There's a reservation in our name for next Friday. Our anniversary. I'd like to change it." Marco looked confused. "You still want to celebrate?" "Not with Zara," Everett clarified. "I need the reservation to remain in the system, but I'd like to book a private room for a different group that evening." Understanding dawned in Marco's eyes. "Ah, the lady thinks you will reconcile on this special day." something like that. "Consider it done," Marco said, patting Everett's hand. The small room in the back, very private, very appropriate for important conversations, yes? "Yes," Everett agreed. "And Marco, if Zara calls to confirm the reservation, I will say only that everything is arranged as usual." Marco tapped the side of his nose. "Some wounds need truth to heal." "I understand." After leaving the restaurant, Everett drove to his bank and withdrew $10,000 from his personal savings account, money he'd been setting aside for years, separate from their joint finances. He'd been saving for a surprise anniversary trip to Italy. The irony wasn't lost on him. In his car, he carefully counted out the cash, divided it into 2 envelopes, and placed them in his briefcase. The remaining steps of his plan would require financial flexibility that couldn't be tracked through credit cards or bank statements. His phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. Files delivered to requested addresses. Confirmation receipts attached. Everett opened the attachment. Delivery confirmations for packages sent to 8 different people. Each name on the list represented a piece of the life he and Zara had built together. Her parents, his sister, their closest friends, her mentor. From college. The packages contained nothing yet, just instructions to keep the envelopes sealed until they received a second package, along with an invitation to meet at Vincenzo's on Friday evening. The real information would be delivered later, after Everett had finished gathering everything he needed. Back at his apartment, Everett added to his spreadsheet, marking off completed tasks and adding new ones. The document had grown complex, with multiple tabs organizing different aspects of what he now thought of as his restoration project. Not revenge, restoration. The distinction mattered to him. Revenge would be destroying Zara and Dominic simply to make them suffer. Restoration was about rebalancing the scales, ensuring consequences matched actions, and reclaiming what had been taken from him: his dignity, his truth, his future. His phone rang. Zara again. This time, he answered, "Everett, you finally picked up." Her voice was breathless with surprise. "I did. I've been so worried. How are you?" The concern in her voice almost made him laugh. "Almost. I'm managing," he replied neutrally. "Can we talk? Maybe meet for coffee? I miss you so much, Ev." Everett closed his eyes, remembering the security footage of her using his badge, the photos of her with Dominic months before she claimed they'd met, the emails plotting how to use his work to advance their careers. "Actually," he said, "I've been thinking about our anniversary next week." "Our anniversary?" Hope flooded her voice. "You've been thinking about it? It's still important to me," he said carefully. 8 years together means something. I thought maybe we could have dinner at Vincenzo's, like we planned." The silence on the other end told him she was trying to process this unexpected turn. Are you saying you want to try again? To work on us?" "I'm saying I'm ready to talk. Really talk. About everything." "Oh, Everett." He could hear the tears in her voice. "Yes, of course. I'll cancel anything else. Vincenzo's at 7. Like always?" "Like always," he confirmed. "And Zara? Don't tell anyone. Not yet. Let's keep this between us until we've had a chance to figure things out." "Of course," she promised. "Just us. Thank you for giving us another chance." After they hung up, Everett leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The genuine hope in her voice should have made him feel guilty. Instead, it only reinforced his resolve. She was still lying, still manipulating, still playing the devoted wife while hiding her true actions. His phone chimed again with an email notification from Caroline Winters. Documents prepared as requested. Ready for signature. One more piece falling into place. Everett updated his spreadsheet, then closed his laptop. Outside his apartment window, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Just over a week until the anniversary. Dinner that Zara believed would be a reconciliation. Instead, it would be a reckoning. Friday evening arrived with the perfect dramatic flair. A light rainfall that left the city glistening under streetlights. The kind of weather that belonged. In pivotal movie scenes, Everett adjusted his tie in the mirror of his apartment, studying his reflection. The man who looked back at him seemed older somehow, his eyes holding a wisdom earned through pain. He'd chosen his navy suit. The one Zara had always said brought out his eyes, not for her benefit, but because tonight was about reclaiming pieces of himself, including his appearance. The final touch was his wedding band, which he slipped back onto his finger after weeks of carrying it in his pocket. A prop for tonight's performance? Nothing more. Vincenzo's was already busy when he arrived, the warm lighting and soft music creating the romantic atmosphere that had made it their special place. Marco met him at the door with a solemn nod. "Everything is prepared as you requested," he said quietly. "The private room in the back. Your guests arrived 10 minutes ago. I seated them as instructed." "And the second delivery?" "Arrived this afternoon. I placed the envelopes as you specified." Everett handed him a thick envelope. "Thank you, Marco, for everything." The owner tucked the envelope away without looking inside. "Sometimes the kindest cut is the cleanest, my friend." Everett checked his watch. 6:55. Zara would arrive any minute, expecting an intimate reunion dinner. Instead, she would find the careful construction of her life waiting to be dismantled. He made his way to the private dining room, pausing outside the door to gather himself. Inside were the people who mattered most to them. Her parents, Robert and Diana, his sister, Naomi, their closest friends, Trent and Mia, her college mentor, Professor Winters, his best friend, Marcus, and their couple friends, Jordan and Elise. 9 people who had witnessed their relationship from different angles, who had celebrated their milestones and supported their marriage. 9 people who deserved to know the truth. He entered the room to a chorus of confused greetings. They'd all received his mysterious invitation, but none knew the purpose of the gathering. Their expressions ranged from concern to curiosity to barely concealed discomfort. "Everett," Diana Lawson rose from her seat, extending her hands to him. Zara's mother had always been kind to him, treating him like the son she'd never had. "What's this about? Where's Zara?" "She'll be here soon," he answered, squeezing her hands gently before turning to address the room. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I know this is unusual." "Unusual is an understatement," Robert Lawson muttered. "Secret invitations, sealed envelopes we're not supposed to open yet, meeting at your anniversary dinner without my daughter present." Dad, Jordan, Zara's older brother, laid a hand on his father's arm. "Let's hear him out." Everett's phone buzzed. A text from Marco. "She has arrived. I need to step out for a moment," he told the group. "There are envelopes with your names in front of each place setting. Please don't open them yet." He slipped out and made his way to the main dining room just as Marco was greeting Zara at the entrance. She looked beautiful in a deep green dress that complemented her dark hair, which fell in loose waves around her shoulders. Her eyes scanned the restaurant anxiously until they found him, relief washing over her face. "Everett?" she breathed, crossing to him quickly. She moved as if to embrace him, then hesitated, settling for a gentle touch to his arm instead. "You're here." "I said I would be." He maintained a neutral expression, though his heart hammered in his chest. "You look nice." "Thank you." She smoothed her dress nervously. "I wasn't sure what to wear. I wanted to look special," he finished for her. "I understand. It is our anniversary." Hope flickered in her eyes. 8 years. 8 years, he echoed. A lot can happen in 8 years. Marco approached with menus. "Your table is ready, but—" He glanced at Everett with practiced confusion. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. The reservation is not for the main dining room." "What do you mean?" Zara asked, frowning. "We have a private room reserved," Everett explained calmly. "For our special occasion." Her smile returned, touched with relief. "Oh, that's perfect. More intimate. If only she knew." Everett guided her through the restaurant with a light hand at the small of her back, a familiar gesture that once would have been affectionate, but now felt like steering a stranger. Outside the private room, he paused. "Before we go in," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I've given this a lot of thought. What happened? What it means for us? What comes next?" "Me too," she said earnestly. "I've thought of nothing else, Ev. I know we have a lot to work through, but I love you. We can rebuild." He studied her face, the face he'd woken up to for 8 years, the face he'd once believed would never lie to him. Behind her sincerity lurked something else, something he might never have noticed if he hadn't seen the evidence of her true character. Calculation. "Let's go in," he said, pushing open the door. Zara stepped into the room and froze. 9 pairs of eyes turned to her, expressions ranging from confusion to concern. This was clearly not the intimate anniversary dinner she had expected. "What? What is this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "The truth," Everett answered simply. "Please, take a seat." He guided her to an empty chair at the head of the table across from his own. As she sat, her eyes darted nervously around the room, taking in the faces of their closest friends and family members, all watching her with varying degrees of discomfort. "Everyone has an envelope," Everett explained, his voice steady. "Inside is information I've gathered over the past 3 weeks. Information about the woman we all thought we knew." "Everett," Zara whispered, color draining from her face. "What are you doing?" "What you forced me to do," he replied. He turned to the others. "You can open them now." The sound of tearing paper filled the room, followed by a heavy silence as each person examined the contents of their envelope. The documents varied slightly, each personalized to reflect their relationship with Zara and what she had shared, with or hidden from them. Diana Lawson gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Robert's face hardened as he read. Marcus, who already knew most of it, simply closed his eyes briefly. Professor Winters removed her glasses, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Is this true?" Jordan asked, looking between Everett and his sister. "Every word," Everett confirmed. Zara sat rigid in her chair, her eyes fixed on the empty place setting before her. "You had no right," she said, her voice tight with anger and humiliation. "I had every right," Everett countered. "These people have supported us, celebrated us, invested in our relationship. They deserve to know who they've been supporting." One by one, their friends and family members stood and left the table. Some with whispered apologies to Everett, others with disappointed glances at Zara. Diana paused to lay a trembling hand on her daughter's shoulder before following her husband out. Jordan looked as though he might stay, then shook his head and left, without a word. Soon, only Everett and Zara remained, facing each other across the empty table. "This isn't revenge," Everett said, meeting her tear-filled glare. "It's justice." Zara stared at him, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Justice?" You call humiliating me in front of everyone we care about justice. I call revealing the truth. Justice, Everett replied calmly. Everything in those envelopes is factual. I didn't embellish or exaggerate. I simply showed them who you really are. And who am I, Everett? Her voice cracked. Some monster? Some villain you've created to make yourself the hero? You're someone who cheated on her husband, who conspired with her lover to steal confidential information, who lied repeatedly to everyone in that room. He gestured to the empty chairs. I didn't create this narrative. You did. The restaurant continued operating around their private room, the sounds of clinking glasses and murmured conversations creating a surreal backdrop to their confrontation. Marco had closed the door, giving them privacy for this final act. What happens now? Zara asked, wiping at her tears with the linen napkin. Now, the consequences of your actions play out, Everett said, starting tomorrow. 3 days later, the ripples of Everett's revelation spread outward with devastating efficiency. When Zara arrived at her office Monday morning, she found security waiting at her desk. Ms. Mercer, the guard said uncomfortably, I need to ask you to come with me to HR. In a sterile conference room, Meridian's head of human resources and a company lawyer informed her that an internal investigation had uncovered serious breaches of confidentiality and corporate ethics. They had evidence of unauthorized access to secure systems, sharing of proprietary information, and collusion to manipulate internal promotions. We're placing you on administrative leave, pending further investigation, the HR director explained, sliding a document across the table. Your company devices and access credentials have been temporarily suspended. Does this have anything to do with Dominic Reed? Zara asked, her voice hollow. The brief exchange of glances between the HR director and lawyer told her everything. Mr. Reed's employment was terminated this morning, the lawyer stated flatly. In the parking lot, Zara sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She pulled out her phone to call Dominic, only to find his number was no longer in service. Her text messages to him from the previous evening showed as undelivered. When she finally got home, a voicemail was waiting from her mother. Zara, your father and I need some time. Whatever it showed us, we just need time to process everything. I love you, but I'm very disappointed. By Friday, Zara's carefully constructed life had collapsed entirely. Dominic had seemingly vanished. Rumor had it he'd left the city altogether. The investigation at Meridian had expanded, with IT forensics teams reconstructing every instance of data access from her devices. Former colleagues avoided her calls. Friends who had received Everett's evidence packages responded to her explanations with variations of, "I need space," or didn't respond at all. Jordan was the only family member who agreed to meet her, and even he kept their coffee short. How did it all go so wrong? She asked her brother as he prepared to leave after barely 30 minutes. Jordan sighed, his expression a mixture of pity and disappointment. You made choices, Zara. Bad ones. And Everett made sure those choices had consequences. He destroyed my life. No, Jordan corrected her gently. You did that. He just made sure everyone knew about it. That evening, alone in the house that still held echoes of her marriage, Zara scrolled through social media. A mutual friend had tagged Everett in a photo at a community fundraiser. He looked thin but composed, smiling politely at the camera, a donation check visible in his hand. The caption mentioned his generous contribution to the Victim Support Network in honor of those who had suffered betrayal. The calculated public goodwill stung worse than any shouting match could have. While her reputation crumbled, Everett was rebuilding his with quiet dignity. He hadn't spoken ill of her to others. He hadn't needed to. The evidence spoke for itself. Her phone rang, her lawyer, with more bad news. "The company is considering pressing charges, Zara. The unauthorized access to their systems falls under computer fraud statutes. They're willing to consider a settlement if you cooperate fully with their investigation. And if I don't, then they'll pursue criminal charges. And based on what I've seen of their evidence, they'd win." After hanging up, Zara wandered through the house, running her fingers over the furniture she and Everett had chosen together, the photos they'd hung, the life they'd built. In her bedroom, she opened his closet. Most of his clothes were gone, but a few shirts still hung there, forgotten or deliberately left behind. She buried her face in one, inhaling the lingering scent of his cologne, and finally allowed herself to cry without restraint. Not just for losing him, but for the person she'd become, someone she barely recognized. Across town, Everett sat at his desk in his sparse apartment, staring at a sealed envelope addressed to Zara. Inside was a letter he'd written and rewritten a dozen times, trying to find the words to express everything he felt. Not just the anger and betrayal, but the deeper grief of losing the future he'd believed in. The letter wasn't for now. It was for later, when the initial shock had faded and the real work of healing could begin. For both of them. He placed it in his desk drawer, next to the divorce papers his lawyer had prepared. His phone chimed with a text from Dr. Patel. "Just checking in. How are you feeling after this week?" Everett considered the question seriously. The initial satisfaction of exposing Zara's deception had faded, leaving something quieter and more complex in its wake. Not happiness. He wasn't sure when that emotion would return, but perhaps the beginnings of peace. "I'm ready for what comes next," he replied. He opened his laptop and booked a one-way ticket to Costa Rica, where a disaster relief organization needed volunteers to help rebuild communities affected by recent floods. 3 months away from everything familiar, focusing on others instead of his own pain sounded exactly right. As he packed his bag that night, Everett placed the sealed envelope for Zara in the top drawer of his desk. Whatever came next, for him, for her, for the remnants of the life they'd shared, would unfold in its own time. Justice had been served. Now healing could begin. 6 months later, Zara Mercer stood at her mailbox in a small apartment across town, sorting through bills and advertisements. The modest one-bedroom was nothing like the house she'd shared with Everett, but it was what she could afford on her new salary as an assistant marketing coordinator at a local retail chain. The only job she'd been able to secure after the scandal. At Meridian, among the usual mail was a large manila envelope with no return address. Inside, she found divorce papers and a smaller sealed envelope with her name written in Everett's familiar handwriting. She carried both to her kitchen table, set aside the divorce papers, and stared at the letter for a long moment before carefully opening it. "Zara, if you're reading this, 6 months have passed since that night at Vincenzo's. I expect you hate me for what I did. Exposing your affair, your deception at work, the ways you manipulated our shared life for your benefit. Perhaps you believe I set out to destroy you. That was never my goal. The truth is simpler and more complex. I needed the people in our lives to see the reality I discovered. Not a story filtered through anger or hurt, not rumors or speculation, but documented facts. The evidence I gathered wasn't personal vengeance, it was self-preservation. You took more from me than our marriage when you betrayed me. You jeopardized my career, my reputation, my ability to trust. You made me question every memory we shared, every plan we made, every promise you spoke. In those first dark days after finding you with Dominic, I felt utterly erased, as if the person I had been no longer existed. I could have responded with rage. I could have sought to harm you as you harmed me. Many would say I would have been justified, but that path would have changed me into someone I didn't want to become. Destroying you wouldn't restore what I lost. It would only ensure I lost more of myself in the process, so I chose differently. I chose truth over vengeance, transparency over retaliation. I made sure everyone knew exactly what had happened, not through emotion-laden accusations, but through irrefutable evidence. Then I stepped away and let natural consequences unfold. You're probably wondering about the money. When we separated, I withdrew $10,000 from my personal savings. That money wasn't used to investigate you or to pay for the divorce. It was donated to establish a foundation called Restoration that supports people rebuilding their lives after betrayal and fraud. The foundation is registered in both our names. Why include your name? Because without your actions, I never would have discovered this path. In a strange way, your betrayal forced me to find strength I didn't know I possessed, and compassion I might otherwise never have developed. I'm writing this from a small coastal village thousands of miles away, where I've spent the past months helping families rebuild homes destroyed by natural disaster. Every day, I work alongside people who have lost everything, yet still find reasons to smile, to be kind, to move forward. They've taught me more about resilience than any self-help book ever could. My hands are calloused now. My skin is tanned. At night, I fall asleep to the sound of ocean waves instead of city traffic. I'm not the same person who walked into our bedroom that day and found you with another man. I'm someone new, shaped by pain, but not defined by it. I don't know what your life looks like now. I hope you've found your way to some version of peace. Not because I forgive what you did, but because bitterness is a poison I refuse to wish on anyone, even you. The divorce papers are straightforward. The house is sold. The proceeds have been divided as outlined on page 4. The retirement accounts remain separate, as they always were. I've asked for nothing beyond what was always mine. My lawyer will handle the details if you sign and return them as directed. I loved you enough to marry you, respected you enough to be honest with you, and in the end, valued myself enough to walk away. My revenge wasn't hurting you. It was refusing to let you turn me into someone who hurts others. The greatest revelation in all of this wasn't discovering your betrayal. It was discovering my own capacity to rise above it. Everett Zara read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. On the third reading, she noticed a small card that had fallen from the envelope. A brochure for the Restoration Foundation, with details about its mission to support people rebuilding after betrayal. The foundation's logo was a simple phoenix, rising, with both their names listed as founders. She set the letter down and moved to her window, staring out at the city lights coming on as dusk settled. Somewhere out there, far beyond those lights, Everett was building a new life, one she would never be part of. The realization that had been forming over the past months solidified with crushing clarity. His response to her betrayal hadn't been about punishing her at all. It had been about preserving himself, about refusing to let her actions define him or determine who he would become. While she had lost nearly everything, her career, many friends, her parents' trust, her marriage, Everett had found something. Most people search for their entire lives, Purpose born from pain, strength forged in fire. The divorce papers waited on her table, the final chapter of their story together. She would sign them tomorrow, closing the book on 8 years that had ended not with the happily ever after she'd once imagined, but with a lesson she would carry forever. That night, Zara searched online for the Restoration Foundation, reading testimonials from people who had received support. Scrolling through the photos, she stopped suddenly at an image that made her breath catch. Everett, sun-bronzed and smiling, surrounded by children in a village of small houses with new roofs. He looked different, leaner, somehow more substantial. Despite the weight loss, his eyes clear and focused in a way they hadn't been in the final years of their marriage. He looked like a man who had discovered something essential about himself, something that couldn't be taken away by anyone else's choices. On a secluded beach thousands of miles away, Everett sat on the sand watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Beside him was Elena, a local teacher who had lost her school in the flood, but never her determination to educate the village children. They'd become friends over the past months, her quiet strength a steady presence as he rebuilt not just homes, but himself. "You are quiet tonight," she observed, her English careful but clear. "Just thinking," he replied. "Today marks 6 months since I made a difficult choice." Elena nodded, asking no questions. She knew pieces of his story, enough to understand that he carried both pain and healing within him. "In my culture," she said after a while, "we believe that when something breaks, the repair can make it stronger, more beautiful than before." She drew a pattern in the sand. "Like these broken pieces joined with gold, the damage becomes part of the beauty." Everett watched the waves erase her drawing, thinking about her words. The breaking had been necessary. The gold that joined the pieces now, that was the work he'd been doing here, among people who understood loss and renewal better than anyone. "I'm flying home tomorrow," he said, "just for a few weeks, to finish some business. Then I'd like to come back, if there's still work to be done." Elena smiled. "There is always work to be done, Everett. Rebuilding never truly ends. It just changes shape." As darkness settled over the beach, Everett realized that her words applied not just to the village, but to his own life. The rebuilding would continue. Different now, shaped by what had broken, but stronger for having survived the breaking. He hadn't expected this outcome when he caught Zara with Dominic that afternoon in their bedroom. He couldn't have imagined that betrayal would lead him here, to this beach, to this understanding of himself. The revelation wasn't in the shock of discovery, or even in the justice of consequences. The revelation was simpler. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't revenge, but renewal. That was the end of this story about what happened when a husband caught his wife cheating and chose a path of truth over vengeance. Where are you listening from? I'd love to know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this emotional journey, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more interesting stories like this one. Don't forget to share with your friends and family to spread kindness and awareness about the power of choosing dignity over destruction when faced with betrayal. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back soon with another compelling story.